minutes just going over, high level, the things that you're really excited that's coming down the pike for downtown Jacksonville, and then we can dive into a couple of those?
Sure. Let me talk about them in a couple buckets. So one bucket I would use is my infrastructure bucket, which for us means projects that we're funding that are capital type projects. And that includes everything from restoring two-way traffic on some of our downtown streets. Once upon a time, they were two-way. They were converted to one-way, which helped to get everybody out of downtown and to the suburbs, but doesn't do much for downtown retail, downtown restaurants, downtown walkability. And so we're in the process of restoring two-way traffic. We have multiple park projects underway and a park study that's looking at what we need in neighborhood parks. So it's everything from a dog run or a playground that supports downtown residents to things that are destination parks that will draw people from all over the county and become a tourist destination as well. And there are many of those in process. We are looking at implementation of the Emerald Trail, which is our version of Atlanta Beltline and the San Antonio Riverwalk combined. We have extensions of the Riverwalk on both the north and south bank that is a promenade along the water, but it will also be punctuated by additional landscape and interactive features and art, public art. And then the Florida Department of Transportation is building a connection across the Fuller Warren Bridge. So the north and south bank will have a dedicated bike ped connection between the two. That's all coming. There are multiple kayak launches and water taxi stops and docks being built at regular intervals. There is a nightly show that's going to be produced. That's just a sample of all of the kind of infrastructure projects we're doing. We have some road diets where we are widening sidewalks to facilitate sidewalk cafe use, narrowing travel lanes. Then going along with that, same time, we are looking at this from what are the financial gaps with respect to supporting development activity? You mentioned there are vacant buildings. So where do we see most of our vacant buildings? They're mostly the older historic structures. They may or may not be designated as landmarks, but they're old. And in order to retrofit those old buildings, it takes money. And the economics just don't support the cost of doing it right now. So how can we encourage those storefronts to be activated? How can we create dining districts and put restaurants in those? And how can we facilitate the rehab of the whole historic building into an adaptive reuse? Those are programs that we created over the last 2 years where we provide various incentive levels in order to help bridge those financial gaps. And again, the goal is to create that retail environment downtown that supports the residential use downtown. And all the time with our eye on the target of the commercial office users and making this a place where they like to work.
And there's so much there to get excited about, but let me just kind of bring a real world example into just one element of what Lori just shared with us. She talked about how those older buildings had sat vacant for many years, decades sometimes. And the reason is because it just didn't make sense for any developer to go in there and spend the multi-million dollars worth of renovations to do it. And if the numbers don't make sense, then those buildings are just going to be vacant. Well, JWB has purchased 5 downtown buildings in the span of the last year and a half. 2 of those buildings needed significant renovations. And without Lori's leadership and without these programs to basically unlock the incentive programs that will be attractive enough for a developer to go in there, JWB would not have bought maybe any of those buildings, definitely not 2 of those buildings, because we were then allowed to run the numbers with an incentives package that would work so that we can get in there and spend over $10 million to renovate this entire corner of downtown. And the really cool thing is that it's not just going to take 2 buildings to get renovated to make a difference. It's going to take multiple buildings in a small cluster to jumpstart this. And I was thinking about just the impact of those programs that you've put together, Lori. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's at least 4 projects that have gone online since you announced the program, the Downtown Preservation and Restoration program.
Yeah, I think there are at least 4 that have actually gone through our board and received approval, but we probably have another 3 or 4 in the pipeline that are people approaching us. And these are all the eligible area is the Downtown Historic District, and the Downtown Historic District is a subset of the downtown as a whole. But it is an area where you saw the majority of those vacant buildings. And those vacant buildings are just a real challenge for creating vibrancy at night. If you have to walk through past 2 dead spaces to get from one restaurant to another, it makes you feel unsafe. It really is a challenge that we knew we had to address. So we're very excited to see the momentum building on those and look forward to actually getting them constructed. Again, I have to wait for 1.5 years to see those come to reality, but it will make a big difference.
When I think about a tactical advantage that Jacksonville has, it is these historic buildings over the other big markets in Florida, right? Like Tampa has a very small historic district. Miami has like no historic district. Orlando, I have no idea, right? I just think about Mickey and Minnie, but Jacksonville it's called the First Coast for a reason, right? So we have all these historic buildings. You mentioned millennials love vintage stuff, right? I'm one of them. And these like historic buildings and restorations are these beautiful things that you see all over Europe that attach you to the history and culture of a space and create this sense of space. What are the outside of the cool factor and what it is? What are the incentives? Can you give us some examples of the type of like incentive levers that you'd have to like maneuver in order to make it attractive for developers, and where the city wins and the developer wins and how it all kind of works? Are you able to talk about that?
Sure. So you're right. The character is part of it. The character is certainly a selling point, but we're not all just about the aesthetic. And from our standpoint, we know that the downtown property values, which are largely driven by downtown rents, because they're calculated, a property appraiser calculates them on an NOI basis, that though we will see substantial increases in those if we see these buildings put back into service. So many of these buildings were those department store buildings that I talked about once, or other retail establishments, multi-floor retail buildings that need to be put back into service. And so we're looking at it as creating an overall economic boost to the core of downtown from a tax revenue standpoint on the city side. In order to do that, it was clear to us at the simplest level that the construction costs and the debt one had to take out to finance those construction costs, the rents at the moment are not sufficient to cover the debt service. So what we had to do was, how do we bridge that gap? And our approach is looking at it from eligible exterior improvements, eligible interior improvements, and looking at the cost of doing those things, and then helping to fund and offset that construction cost on the front end so the project is viable from day one. That was really, and these get a 10-year tax rebate or abatement as a result of being historic landmarks. So that also helps on the operating cost side. So ours is really a calculation where we look at the equity that a developer puts into the project, and the city can fund up to 40% of the total development cost if we are actually meeting those various construction elements. We also had a program that allows for code compliance renovations, even if you're not a historic structure. So think about an old building that's out of service because it doesn't have a proper fire escape, or it doesn't have sprinklers, or, it wasn't built to today's standards. And the cost of doing it in a small building isn't justified. So it just sits. And our opportunity there is if we can help bring them up to current code, which in turn allows them to be used today or rented, it's meaningful to our downtown.
And the idea here, and Lori, correct me if I'm wrong, but Right. We're these incentive dollars are a short-term play, right? We're trying to create this flywheel where incentive dollars are not needed to activate these spaces, right? So the long run is that incentive dollars would not be required. Incentive dollars are not required in Charlotte, Denver, I would say New York. I don't know about New York right now, right? New York before pre-pandemic, but right, you get these flywheels activated in a downtown space. It builds on itself, and then it supports itself, and then it continues to grow even better and better.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's all driven by rents. And in our case, our rents they've seen dramatic growth over the last 5 years. And it is that dramatic growth that has also unlocked the opportunities downtown. Because when we were at $1.25 in downtown, there was no chance. Now that we are knocking on the door of $2 a foot downtown, and you mentioned one of the great success stories is the Barnett, which is a renovation that creates those cool loft apartments, if you will, in a historic building. And they're one of the buildings that are driving rents downtown. Once we start to get high enough on that rent level, now you don't need the incentives anymore. That's the whole goal here.